The concept of justice is a fragile thing. It doesn't exist in the leather-bound books that line my chambers, nor does it live in the cold, unyielding marble pillars of this courthouse. Over my years presiding as a judge, I have learned a profound truth. Justice only breathes when we look past the rigid ink of statutes and see the beating heart of the human being standing before the bench. When I first put on this black robe, my mentor gave me a piece of advice I never forgot. He said, "Boyd, the moment you start treating people as case numbers, you've lost the moral authority to judge them." I carry that warning with me every single day. The law is meant to be a steadying hand, not a crushing weight. It was a stifling Thursday morning, the heat pressing against the tall courthouse windows. The wooden benches of my courtroom were packed. I looked out over the sea of faces, single mothers, young men with eyes full of quiet fear, and older folks exhausted by the mere effort of survival. For them, this room is the intersection of their deepest fears and their last hope. I took my seat, the familiar heavy silence falling over the room. The first case called was Arthur Pendelton. He was 68 years old, dressed in a faded but meticulously ironed suit that hung loosely on his frail frame. As he approached the podium, his hands trembled slightly. The deep, weathered lines etched into his face were not just signs of aging. They were a physical map of a lifetime spent working hard, playing by the rules, and now facing an unbearable indignity. Standing opposite to him was Prosecutor Miller, sharp, aggressively polished, and notoriously ambitious. He viewed the law not as a shield for the vulnerable, but as a stepping stone for his political career. He carried a stack of files under his arm with a casual arrogance, exuding the crisp, cold energy of a predator in a courtroom that I built to be a sanctuary. Arthur was facing severe, compounding fines over a minor bureaucratic zoning error regarding his small hardware store, a store that had served this community for 40 years. It was a situation that called for a quick conversation, mediation, and a little grace. But as Prosecutor Miller stepped up to the microphone, adjusting his expensive tie with a tight, calculating smile, I knew grace was the last thing on his mind. "Your Honor," Miller began, his voice booming with unnecessary theatricality, "the state intends to pursue the maximum penalty. Ignorance of the law is no excuse, and we must make an example out of this defendant." I looked from Miller's smug expression to Arthur's downcast, terrified eyes. I felt a slow, familiar fire ignite in my chest. The game was set, but I was about to change the rules. Make an example? The words hung in the stifling air of the courtroom, tasting bitter and hollow. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the heavy oak of the bench, and stared down at Prosecutor Miller. I let the silence stretch out until it became suffocating. In this room, a heavy, deliberate silence is often my most effective gavel. It forces people to hear the echo of their own arrogance. "Mr. Miller," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying to the very back row of the gallery, "you want to make an example out of a man who has sold winter salt, snow shovels, and replacement hinges to this neighborhood since before you were even born? A man who is standing here facing financial ruin over a misfiled piece of municipal paperwork?" Miller didn't flinch, though a muscle in his jaw twitched. He was a man who lived strictly by the letter of the law, because he fundamentally lacked the empathy required to understand its spirit. He straightened his posture, adjusting his cuffs. "Your Honor, Chapter 14, Section B clearly states that failure to update a commercial zoning classification results in a mandatory compounding fine. It is a matter of strict liability. We cannot selectively enforce the law simply because the defendant is a local fixture. The city expects accountability." I shifted my gaze away from the prosecutor's cold ambition and looked at Arthur Pendelton. The older man was gripping the edges of the wooden podium so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. His shoulders were slumped. He looked like a man watching his entire life's work being dismantled by someone who didn't even care to know his name. "Mr. Pendelton," I said, softening my tone completely. The shift in my voice was deliberate, a bridge built instantly between the elevated bench and the lonely podium. "Tell me what happened. Why wasn't this zoning form updated?" Arthur swallowed hard, his eyes briefly meeting mine before dropping to his worn shoes. His voice trembled as he leaned into the microphone. "Judge, my wife, Martha, She usually handled the books. She handled all the city papers. She passed away last November, Your Honor. It was cancer. He paused, taking a shaky breath. I've just been trying to keep the lights on at the store. I didn't even know the zoning lines had been redrawn by the city council. I would never intentionally break the rules. I just, I just didn't know. A quiet, mournful murmur rippled through the gallery behind him. You could feel the collective heartbreak, the shared understanding of what profound grief does to a person's capacity to manage the mundane details of daily survival. I felt a tight knot form in my own throat. Grief is a heavy enough sentence. The court doesn't need to pile on the weight. Objection, Your Honor, Miller barked, his voice slicing brutally through the fragile, heavy emotion in the room. The defendant's personal tragedies, while unfortunate, are entirely irrelevant to the statutory violation. The city has lost revenue, and the statute does not grant leniency for bereavement. I slowly took off my reading glasses and placed them on the desk. The sharp click of the frames hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot. I locked eyes with the prosecutor, feeling the familiar, righteous fire that tells me it's time to remind a lawyer what justice actually looks like. Counsel, I said, the temperature in my voice dropping to freezing. Do not interrupt a grieving man in my courtroom ever again, and do not ever stand there and tell me that the human condition is irrelevant to the law. The courtroom fell into a silence so profound you could hear the distant, muffled sounds of traffic outside the high windows. Prosecutor Miller's mouth opened, then closed, resembling a fish pulled suddenly from the water. He was entirely unaccustomed to being spoken to with such raw, unfiltered authority. He looked around the room, perhaps expecting the gallery to validate his strict adherence to the statute, but all he found were hard, unforgiving stares. The people in those benches didn't care about Chapter 14, Section B. They cared about Arthur. They cared about Martha, the woman who had likely sold them their first set of house keys. Your Honor, Miller finally stammered, his polished confidence fracturing as he attempted to rebuild his shattered facade. I only meant that the city's revenue, I cut in, my voice low and vibrating with a suppressed anger that I rarely let loose from the bench. Let us talk about the city, Mr. Miller. You stand there in your tailored suit and speak of the city as if it is some insatiable machine that feeds on the misery of its citizens. But the city is not a ledger. The city is Arthur Pendelton waking up at 5 a.m. for 40 years to shovel the sidewalk in front of his store so his neighbors won't slip. I picked up the thick manila file resting in front of me, the pages detailing the compounding penalties. I leafed through them deliberately, letting the sharp rustle of the paper fill the quiet room. I am looking at these citations, I continued, my eyes scanning the absurd mathematics of bureaucracy. The original fine for failing to file this piece of paper was $50. $50. But because Mr. Pendleton was sitting by his wife's hospice bed instead of reading city council zoning memorandums, this penalty has compounded daily over the last 6 months. It now stands at $4,200. I dropped the file back onto the heavy oak desk. It landed with a sickening, definitive thud. $4,200 for a piece of paper that changes absolutely nothing about how his hardware store operates. That is not justice, Mr. Miller. That is extortion dressed up as municipal policy. Miller's face flushed a deep, angry red. His pride was wounded, and for a lawyer of his ilk, pride is often mistaken for principle. Your Honor, I must protest. The law is applied equally. The law is applied blindly by those who lack the courage to truly see, I countered, leaning back in my chair, holding his gaze until he was forced to look away. You are using a technicality to bankrupt a grieving widower, and you are doing it in the name of the people of this city. Well, the people are sitting right behind you, counsel. Why don't you turn around and ask them if this is the kind of protection they want? A man in the back row, wearing a worn mechanic's jacket, let out a low, audible amen. It was a tiny breach of courtroom decorum, but I didn't even think about reaching for my gavel. Sometimes the gallery speaks the truest verdict. The silence following that solitary amen from the gallery was thicker than the summer humidity. Prosecutor Miller practically vibrated with indignation. He wasn't used to a judge who refused to play the bureaucratic game, who didn't just blindly rubber stamp the state's demands. For men like Miller, the courtroom is merely a chessboard, and people like Arthur Pendelton are nothing more than pawns meant to be sacrificed for a win. Your Honor, with all due respect, I am merely executing the duties of the district attorney's office. The statute is rigid for a reason, Miller argued, his voice taking on a defensive, almost whining edge. We cannot set a precedent of ignoring the law out of misplaced sympathy. I opened the file again, my eyes scanning past the absurd fine amounts to the signature at the bottom of the original citation. Then I turned to the broader docket history on my monitor. I had spent my entire weekend reviewing Miller's recent case files, prompted by a troubling pattern I had noticed over the last few months. It was time to bring that pattern into the light. Are you, Mr. Miller? I asked softly, a dangerous calm settling over me. Are you merely executing your duties? Because looking at your prosecutorial record, I see a very specific, highly selective interpretation of duty. I reached into my drawer and pulled out a separate, much thicker stack of printed dockets. I let them drop onto the heavy wood of the bench with a loud thwack. I have here the records of 14 other small businesses in this exact district. A bakery run by a first-generation immigrant, a family-owned pharmacy, a neighborhood shoe repair shop, all of them cited by your office for minor, obscure municipal infractions over the past year, all of them aggressively prosecuted by you, and all of them slapped with maximum compounding penalties that they could never hope to pay. I leaned forward, resting my folded hands on the desk, locking my eyes onto his. The polished smugness was finally beginning to drain from Miller's face, replaced by a pale, creeping dread. And curiously, counsel, every single one of those businesses is located on the exact two-block commercial stretch slated for the new corporate waterfront redevelopment project, a multi-million-dollar project heavily lobbied for by your former private law firm. A collective, audible gasp swept through the courtroom. The air suddenly felt electric, heavy with the weight of exposed secrets. The gallery, previously just sympathetic to an old man, was now vibrating with justified outrage. Arthur Pendelton looked up, his eyes wide with shock and a dawning realization. The financial tragedy he thought was his own personal failure, the crushing guilt he carried for letting his late wife's paperwork slip while she was dying, was actually a calculated, predatory trap. Objection, Miller shouted, his voice cracking, a sheen of nervous sweat suddenly appearing on his forehead. This is outrageous. This is a baseless accusation, Your Honor. This is the public record. Counsel, I fired back, my voice cracking through the room like a whip, leaving no room for argument. And in my courtroom, the truth is never outrageous. It is mandatory. The air in the courtroom had thickened, feeling so dense it could be cut with a knife. Prosecutor Miller, who only moments ago stood there with the arrogance of a man holding the power of life and death, now looked like an empty shell fracturing under pressure. Beads of cold sweat dotted his smooth forehead. The tailored confidence wrapped in his expensive suit had completely evaporated beneath the gallery's furious gaze. Your Honor, Miller stammered, his voice weak and entirely stripped of its previous booming resonance. That is merely a coincidence. The district attorney's office handles thousands of files a year. Focusing on the redevelopment zone is simply a matter of ensuring urban safety and compliance. A coincidence? I cut him off, my voice not needing volume to pierce through his pathetic excuses. A coincidence that 14 legacy family businesses suddenly become urban safety threats at the exact moment corporate real estate developers need to clear the land? A coincidence that the penalties were compounded to absurd heights, turning a minor clerical error into a financial death sentence? I planted both hands firmly on the bench, leaning down, my words slow and deliberate, hammering into the man standing at the podium. You are not protecting the law, Mr. Miller. You are weaponizing it. You are using complex technicalities to crush the most vulnerable people in this society, people like Mr. Pendleton, who cannot afford to hire a team of expensive lawyers to defend themselves. You have turned this courtroom into a tool for legal extortion to pave the way for corporate greed. I turned my attention back to Arthur Pendelton. The older man was still trembling, but no longer from fear. It was the physical release of a man who had just dropped a crushing weight from his conscience. For months, he had tortured himself, believing his own negligence, while caring for his dying wife, had destroyed his family's legacy. Now, the realization washed over him. He was not a failure. He was simply the target of a ruthless scam dressed up as the law. Mr. Pendleton, I called out to him, my tone shifting instantly from righteous anger to warmth and deep empathy. I want you to hear this clearly. Failing to update that piece of paper was not a crime. It was a human oversight made during the most painful moment of your life. You are not at fault for your store being pushed to the brink of bankruptcy. The fault lies with a system that allowed opportunists to use justice for profit. I looked out over the entire courtroom. The citizens in the gallery hung on to every word, their eyes shining with agreement and a newly rekindled faith in the system. Justice is not a cold machine that merely consumes numbers and statutes, I declared, my voice echoing off the old oak walls. Justice is a shield, and its sole purpose is to protect the people from the cruelty of unchecked power. I didn't wait for Prosecutor Miller to formulate another weak defense. The time for debate had passed. It was time for the court to act. Mr. Miller, I said, my tone shifting to the absolute, unyielding cadence of final authority, I am dismissing the case against Mr. Pendleton with prejudice. Furthermore, I am vacating all associated fines, penalties, and late fees effective immediately. The city will not collect a single dime from this man. Miller opened his mouth, perhaps out of pure reflex, but he wisely snapped it shut. He looked like a man who had just watched his meticulously built, highly lucrative house of cards scatter across the floor. He began hastily shoving his papers into his leather briefcase, his hands visibly shaking. But I am not finished, I continued, leaning back and picking up my pen. The scratching of the nib against the official order form echoed in the silence. I am officially referring you, Mr. Miller, and your handling of these 15 specific zoning cases to the State Bar Disciplinary Board for a comprehensive ethics investigation. I am also signing an immediate order to audit the remaining 14 cases you so aggressively prosecuted in this district. If I find that this municipal court was used to illegally facilitate a corporate real estate land grab, the consequences will extend far beyond a professional reprimand. A profound, collective exhale swept through the gallery behind the prosecution table. It was the sound of a community realizing that the system, which had so often felt like a predator, could still bare its teeth in their defense. I looked down at Arthur Pendelton. The deep, weary lines on his face hadn't magically disappeared, but the crushing, invisible weight that had bowed his shoulders was gone. He stood taller, gripping the podium not for support, but to ground himself. He reached up and wiped a single, rogue tear from his weathered cheek. Mr. Pendleton, I said gently, ensuring my voice carried only comfort. The court clerk will assist you in filling out the proper zoning update form before you leave today. There will be no filing fee. You go home. You take a deep breath. And tomorrow morning, you go back to your hardware store and you keep serving this neighborhood. We need you here. Arthur nodded, his voice choked with profound gratitude. Thank you, Your Honor. God bless you. You don't need to thank me, Arthur, I replied, offering a small, reassuring smile that I reserve for the moments when the law actually works the way it was intended to. You just needed someone to actually read the fine print. I picked up my wooden gavel, feeling its familiar, grounding weight in my palm. Case dismissed. The sharp crack of the wood against the sound block echoed through the courtroom. It did not sound like a tool of punishment. Today, it sounded like the breaking of a chain. As the echo of the gavel faded into the high corners of the ceiling, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted entirely. The oppressive, suffocating tension that had choked the room since 9 o'clock this morning dissolved, replaced by a profound, breathing stillness. Prosecutor Miller did not look up. He moved with a frantic, jerky energy, shoving his impeccably organized files into his expensive leather briefcase without any of his usual precision. The sharp, aggressive posture he had marched in with was gone, replaced by the hunched shoulders of a man desperate to escape the consequences of his own hubris. As he turned and walked down the center aisle, the gallery did not murmur. They simply watched him. They pulled back silently, offering him the cold, hard space reserved for those who have betrayed the public trust. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind him, sealing his exit with a definitive, hollow thud. I watched him go, feeling no sense of triumph, only a quiet, heavy solemnity. It is a terrible thing to watch a man of the law forget why the law exists in the first place. When ambition blinds you to humanity, the robe you wear or the degree on your wall means absolutely nothing. Arthur Pendelton lingered at the podium for a moment longer. He turned and looked back at the gallery, at the faces of his neighbors, the mechanic who had spoken up, the bakery owner, a young mother holding a sleeping toddler. They nodded to him, offering small, quiet gestures of solidarity. When Arthur finally walked down the aisle, his steps were slow, but they were no longer weighed down by the terror of impending ruin. He walked like a man who had just been given his life back. I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the quiet hum of the room wash over me. People often ask me how I endure the endless parade of human mistakes, the constant, exhausting friction of a city colliding with its own rules. They don't understand that the courtroom is not just a place of punishment. When it functions correctly, it is a theater of truth. It is the one place left in society where money, influence, and corporate greed are supposed to bow down to the fundamental dignity of the human spirit. Today, the system had been tested. A predator had tried to use the complex machinery of justice to consume a good, honest man. But the machinery is only as blind as the person operating it. As long as I sit on this bench, I will keep my eyes wide open. I took a deep breath, smoothing the dark, heavy fabric of my robe. The day was far from over. There were more files on my desk, more people waiting in the pews, more lives hanging in the balance of a municipal code. Bailiff, I called out, my voice steady and renewed, the righteous fire in my chest settling into a warm, enduring ember. Call the next case. The afternoon hours stretched into evening, and the relentless heat of the morning finally broke, giving way to a steady, cleansing rain against the tall courthouse windows. The courtroom had emptied hours ago, leaving behind only the faint scent of lemon polish and the lingering echoes of 100 different lives colliding with the law. I sat alone at my bench, the heavy oak smooth beneath my resting hands, feeling the familiar, bone-deep ache that always settles in at the end of a long docket. I looked down at the empty space where Arthur Pendelton had stood just a few hours prior. I thought about his small hardware store, the comforting smell of sawdust and old metal, the familiar bell above the door that had chimed for 40 years. I thought about how dangerously close that bell came to being silenced forever, not by the natural passage of time or by honest failure, but by the cold, calculated machinery of corporate greed. People often believe that the greatest threats to our society come from the shadows, from the violent and the lawless. But sitting in this elevated chair for decades has taught me a much more terrifying truth. The most profound damage is often done in broad daylight by men in expensive suits wielding statutes and technicalities like weapons. True corruption doesn't always break the law. Sometimes it hides behind the law to break people. But today, the system held the line, not because the municipal codes were perfect, but because we chose to look up from the paperwork and actually see the human being standing at the podium. We chose empathy over arithmetic. I stood up, slowly unfastening the heavy black robe that serves as both my armor and my greatest burden. As I draped it over the back of my leather chair, I made a silent vow to the empty room, a promise I renew every single time I step down from this bench. I promise to remember that behind every single docket number is a life, a family, a legacy, and a beating heart. I promise to never let the arrogance of power drown out the quiet, enduring dignity of the vulnerable. I walked out of my chambers and into the cool, rain-washed air of the city, feeling a profound sense of peace. Tomorrow, the heavy oak doors will open again. The endless, messy parade of human frailty, mistakes, and hope will march back into my courtroom. And when they do, I will be there, ready to listen, ready to protect, and ready to prove that here, in this room, justice still has a heart.